There is a clay tablet sitting in a museum right now that describes exactly why the human species was created. Not as a spiritual story, not as a poem, not as a guess, with a kind of specific detail that makes you wonder how anyone in 3000 BCE could have written it without having been in the room when the decision was made. The tablet is Sumerian. It predates the Bible by thousands of years, and buried inside its ancient text is something that mainstream academics have spent decades carefully avoiding. It is not a creation story in the religious sense. It is closer to a work order, a document that describes a problem, a solution, a method, and the being that was built as a result. That being is you. And the reason you were made has nothing to do with love, divine plan, or spiritual purpose. If you have never heard this before, there is a reason. The academic world treats these tablets as mythology, as the confused beliefs of a primitive people who did not understand the world around them. But what happens when you stop treating them as mythology and start reading them as exactly what they claim to be? What you find is not just challenge religion. It challenges everything humanity has ever been told about itself. Human creation is not presented as a mystery in the Sumerian texts. It is presented as a recorded event, with named decision-makers, a documented motivation, and a described method. The Sumerians called humanity the Lulu, the mixed one. According to the tablet, we were not shaped by nature. We were not the product of random evolution. We were designed by someone else for a reason that has nothing to do with love or divine purpose. If the tablets are read literally, the way their writers intended them to be read, then every major religion, every creation story, every answer humanity has ever been given about why it exists collapses into something far more uncomfortable. Not a mystery, not a miracle, a decision made in a meeting. But what happens when you remove that assumption and read the tablets for exactly what they say? What you find changes everything. Subscribe if you want more of this. This channel covers the history they did not teach you in school. Now let's get into it. The story begins in one of the oldest places on Earth, Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, in the region that is today southern Iraq. Roughly 6,000 years ago, something happened there that archaeology still cannot fully explain. A civilization appeared out of almost nowhere. No slow buildup. No gradual progress from simple villages to complex cities. No period where you can watch the knowledge slowly developing over generations. The Sumerians arrived already knowing things that should have taken thousands of years to figure out. They had writing. They had mathematics. They had astronomy accurate enough to track the movements of distant planets. They had legal systems, architectural knowledge, medical understanding, and a detailed picture of the universe that modern scholars are still working to fully decode. Conventional archaeology has spent decades trying to explain where all of this knowledge came from. The answers are never quite satisfying. There is always a gap. Always something that does not fit the standard model of how civilizations are supposed to develop. The Sumerians themselves, however, had a very clear answer to this question. They said they were taught, directly, by beings who came before them. And those beings did not just teach them farming and writing. They left records, physical records pressed into clay, describing who they were, why they came to Earth, and exactly what they needed from the beings they eventually created. Those beings were called the Anunnaki. The word Anunnaki translates roughly as those who came from the heavens to Earth. In some interpretations, it means those of royal blood who descended. The Sumerians did not describe the Anunnaki as gods in the way we use that word today. They described them as physical beings, advanced, powerful, capable of things that ordinary humans could not do. They traveled in objects the Sumerians called vehicles of heaven. They used weapons that destroyed with fire and sound. They had a clear chain of command, internal politics, disagreements between factions, and most importantly for this story, a very serious labor problem. According to the tablets, the Anunnaki came to Earth long before humans existed. They began large-scale operations on this planet. The texts are specific about what those operations involved. Mining, primarily for gold, extracting it from deep within the Earth's crust across enormous operations that spanned continents. This went on for thousands of years. And then the workforce broke. The lower-ranking Anunnaki, the ones performing the actual physical labor, reached a breaking point. The tablets describe them burning their tools, marching to the residence of their commander in the middle of the night, surrounding the building and refusing to leave until their conditions were addressed. A full workforce revolt, demanding change. This is not described as symbolic in the text. It is described as an event. A crisis that forced an emergency meeting at the highest levels of the Anunnaki hierarchy. And the decision made in that meeting is the reason you exist. To understand what the tablets say about why humans were created, you first need to understand what the Sumerians believed the human being actually was. Because their answer is very different from anything you have been taught in school, in church, or anywhere else. In Sumerian thinking, the human being was not a soul that randomly found a body. It was a constructed entity, built to a specification, engineered the same way you would engineer a tool, designed to perform a specific function and built with the materials available. The physical body was called the Balak. The tablets describe it as being made from clay, which in the Sumerian creation text means a mixture of earth material and something they called divine blood. The divine blood referred to the biological material of the Anunnaki themselves. The being produced from this combination was called the Lulu, the mixed one, half earth, half Anunnaki, created by a figure named Enki, working alongside his half-sister Ninmah, in a process the tablets describe with a kind of step-by-step language you expect from a laboratory record, not a religious text. What the Sumerians described was not magic. It was combining, mixing the genetic material of one species with the biological base of another to produce a new type of being. The human being was not the point of the creation story. The human being was the answer to a problem. And the problem was labor. That is not a metaphor. That is what the tablet says. The Atrahasis epic is one of the oldest written stories in human history. It predates the biblical creation account by more than 1,000 years. And when you read it without the preloaded assumption that it is mythology, its structure is immediately striking. It does not read like a poem. It reads like minutes from a meeting. There is a problem stated at the beginning. The Anunnaki labor force has revolted and will not continue working. There is a gathering of senior figures to decide what to do about it. There is a proposal put forward by Enki, create a new type of being using the primitive creatures already present on Earth, combined with Anunnaki biological material. There is a debate among the assembled figures. There is an approval. And then there is an outcome. The Lulu is produced, and purpose stated in the text is not poetic or vague. The Lulu was created to bear the yoke, to take over the labor so that the Anunnaki would not have to continue performing it themselves. Modern scholars read this as a metaphor for the human condition. The burden of existence, the difficulty of life, humanity toiling under the weight of the cosmos. But consider a completely different reading. What if the yoke is not a metaphor? What if the Atrahasis epic is not a symbolic poem about what it feels like to be human, but an actual operational record written by beings who needed to document what they had done, why they had done it, and how? Because documentation is what you produce when you have made a consequential decision. That is exactly what it reads like when you stop filtering it through assumptions. That interpretation sounds extreme until you start checking what other ancient cultures recorded independently. Genesis describes God forming man and placing him in a garden to tend and keep it. The Hebrew word translated as tend means to perform labor. The word translated as keep means to guard, specifically in the sense of not leaving. The first human in the Bible is placed in an enclosed space and given a job on the very first day of his existence. The Vedic texts of ancient India describe the Prajapati creating humanity as a race of beings specifically designed to perform sacrifice, the giving of energy and labor to higher beings so that the structure of the cosmos could be maintained. Humanity in the Vedic account is not the point of creation. It is a functioning component in a larger system. The Book of Enoch describes beings called the Watchers who descended to Earth, possessed advanced knowledge of genetics, astronomy, and metallurgy, and began sharing that knowledge with humans. They were punished severely by the hierarchy above them for doing so. Not because the knowledge was wrong, because it was not supposed to reach the people it reached. The Popol Vuh, the creation text of the ancient Maya, describes the gods making several versions of humanity and destroying each one that came out too capable, too self-aware, too close to understanding its own situation. The final version, the one that survived, was the one that could function but could not see too far. Now put all of that together and hold it next to the Sumerian tablets. Every one of these traditions, from completely different parts of the world, with no direct contact between them, describes the same core situation. Advanced beings, created human workforce, and a very deliberate limit placed on how much that workforce was allowed to know or become. The Sumerians did not frame this as spirituality. They framed it as engineering. And the cross-cultural evidence suggests they were recording something real. This is where the tablets stop being uncomfortable and start being genuinely disturbing. If the Anunnaki designed a human being, why did they design it the way they did? Humans live a fraction of the lifespan that the Sumerian king lists attribute to the Anunnaki themselves. Humans have clear limits in memory, physical endurance, and long-term cognitive continuity that seem almost too precise to be accidental. Long enough to be productive within a single lifetime. Not long enough to accumulate the kind of deep, generational, continuous understanding that would allow a population to fully map its own situation. The answer the tablets suggest is not a comfortable one. A workforce that was too capable would eventually do exactly what the Anunnaki workers had done before humanity existed. It would organize. It would revolt. It would refuse to continue operating within a system it had not agreed to. The entire reason humanity was created in the first place was to solve exactly that problem without having to improve the conditions of the work. So the Lulu was built strong enough to work. It was not built independent enough to question. The Atrahasis epic describes this calculation with quiet precision. The new workers would not remember their divine origin. They would not accumulate enough continuous awareness across generations to understand what they were inside of. They would be born, work, age, and die, and the cycle would reset. The limitations built into the human design were not the cost of creation. They were the goal of it. And the tablet does not soften that conclusion. It states it the same way it states everything else, like a record, not a story. The concealment did not stop with the biological design. According to the tablets and the traditions that extend from them, the suppression of this knowledge was an active, ongoing, multi-layered process that continued long after the initial creation. The first level was the simplest. The Lulu was not told what it was. The creation text described the Anunnaki debating directly whether humanity should have knowledge of its own origins. The decision in most tablet versions is no. The second level developed over time. The relationship between the Anunnaki and humanity was gradually reframed as the centuries passed. Beings who had been described in the earliest texts as physical, technologically advanced managers with a specific operational agenda slowly became gods in the religious sense. Supernatural, perfect, unknowable, beyond question. The third level was applied to the records themselves. The Sumerian tablets, the Egyptian creation accounts, the Vedic texts, all of them were eventually absorbed into religious and cultural frameworks that replaced the operational language with spiritual metaphor. The mining operation became a divine plan. The engineered worker became a beloved creation made in God's image. The labor requirement became a calling, a purpose, a blessing. A workforce that believes it was created because it is loved will continue working without ever asking who benefits from the work. A workforce that knows it was created to serve someone else's specific agenda will not stay quiet for long. The reframing was not an accident. It was the most effective control mechanism ever deployed, and it has held together, largely without challenge, for 6,000 years. But the tablets describe a crack in the system, and the crack comes from an unexpected place. Enki, the same figure credited in the creation text with designing the human being, is described across dozens of separate tablets as something that does not fit cleanly into the role of enforcer. He argued within the Anunnaki hierarchy for humanity's survival when other senior figures wanted the human population reduced or eliminated. He warned a human named Atrahasis about a coming catastrophe that the rest of the hierarchy had decided humanity should not be warned about. He passed what the texts explicitly call forbidden knowledge to select human initiates, knowledge about their own nature, their origins, and their situation inside the system. The Book of Enoch documents the same pattern with different names. Advanced beings sharing knowledge with humans that they were strictly prohibited from sharing, and being punished severely for doing it. But the knowledge survives, passed down through protected lineages, encoded in forms that the hierarchy could not easily destroy. The Gnostic texts, many of them buried and hidden for centuries before their discovery in 1945, describe a spark of genuine, unmanipulated awareness inside each human being, something the control system could not fully reach or suppress, that, if recognized and developed, could change the relationship between the human being and the system it was born into. If you follow all of these threads back far enough, they converge at the same point. Sumer, 6,000 years ago, with the same figure at the center, Enki, the engineer who built the system. And based on the evidence across multiple independent traditions, the same one who quietly passed the key to certain humans and hoped it would survive. That possibility, that the creator of the cage also distributed the means of escaping it, is the most important idea buried inside these texts. And it reframes everything that came after. If the mystery school traditions of the ancient world were not independent spiritual discoveries, but encoded instructions from the same mind that designed the limitation, then they are not religious documents. They are technical documents written in the language of religion, so they could survive in plain sight. The Hermetic texts, the Egyptian funerary knowledge that tells the soul exactly what it will encounter and how to respond. The Tibetan teachings on consciousness and the nature of awareness. The Gnostic Gospels describing a world run by lesser powers that have no claim over the original nature of the human soul. All of them encode the same core message in different symbols and different languages. You were created. You were limited by design. And there is something inside you that exists beneath those limitations that was not part of the engineer design, something that was there before the mixing, and that the design cannot fully contain. The reason this knowledge was kept secret is not because it is sacred in a religious sense. It is because someone with enough power to enforce secrecy needed it kept away from the population it described. A workforce that fully understands the nature of its own creation is a workforce that can decide, for the first time, whether to continue operating within the terms of that creation. That is the threat. That is why it was hidden. And that is precisely why it survived, because Enki, or whoever played that role in the real history, made sure it would. The clay tablet is still sitting in the museum right now. The cuneiform pressed into its surface nearly 6,000 years ago is still readable to those who study it. The story it tells has not changed. The words have not softened over time. Most people will live their entire lives without knowing this tablet exists. Most people who learn it exists will dismiss it immediately as mythology, the misunderstood cosmology of an ancient civilization that did not yet have scientific vocabulary. Some will read it for exactly what it says and sit with the discomfort of taking it seriously. The tablet does not care which category you fall into. It was not written for everyone. The evidence suggests it was written for the record by beings who understood that documentation matters because what they had done was consequential enough to deserve one. The question the tablet leaves you with is not whether the Anunnaki existed. It takes that entirely for granted. The question the tablet leaves you with is what it means that you were made. Not evolved by accident over millions of years. Not breathed into existence by a God who loved you and had a plan for your life. Deliberately, specifically by named individuals with a documented reason that had nothing to do with your well-being. The Sumerians had a specific word for a human being who had come to understand the true nature of their own creation. It appears in the most protected and carefully preserved sections of the tablets. It translates roughly as one who knows the condition of their own making, not one who escaped it, not one who was freed from it by a higher power, simply one who knew it. The knowledge is still available. The tablets are still in the museums. The texts are still legible. The thread that connects the Sumerian creation records to the Egyptian funerary text, to the Gnostic Gospels, to the Tibetan teachings on consciousness is still there for anyone willing to follow it. And somewhere in the gap between what you were told you are and what the oldest written record on Earth says you actually are, the most important question of your existence is waiting. The tablet was written for the few who would ask it, before someone else decided they never should have.